some amazing advances in Photoshop, the process of removing unwanted objects and even recreating or reproducing elements within your photographs has become extremely easy now with the help of Content Aware. At present, there are two options when it comes to using Content Aware in your editing workflow. The first is implementing Content Aware as a fill, which is better suited for working with larger selections. The second option applies when using the Spot Healing Brush tool and actually using Content Aware as the sampling type, which is better suited for smaller selections. So to start off with, the first thing you need to do when using Content Aware is actually to make a rough selection around an object in your image that you'd like to remove or filled in using Content Aware. Now, make sure that you actually leave ample amount of room around the object that you're actually going to select. So this doesn't need to be precise. So what I'm going to do is, there are two objects in this particular image that are slightly annoying to me. So I've got this sort of rust that's been left over here, this debris on the left hand bottom corner, and there's a little bit over here. Now I could probably get away with this one, but I find this one a little bit distracting. So in order to actually go ahead and remove it, let's actually make a selection. So I'm going to use the lasso tool, which is probably the easiest option for making a quick selection, and you can get to that just by pressing L on your keyboard, or basically going to your tool menu on the left hand side of your working space. Now once you've selected it, essentially all I'm going to do is I'm actually going to include this here as well. So I'm just going to draw a really rough sort of outline around this area, and I'm leaving sort of ample amount of space. So you don't want to make a selection that's really precise and right up against the object that you're actually trying to fill in. So now that we've gone ahead and made our selection, we have the option of feathering it. And I like to feather it just in order to reduce the likelihood that we end up with coarse outlines around the areas of the selection when Content Aware actually does its rendering and fills in that area. So in order to do that, we can just go up to Select, scroll down to Modify, and then go to Feather. Now I like to use a small pixel amount for my feathering, usually sort of around 3 to 5 pixels is sufficient. So I'm going to click OK on that. Now from here we can get to the Content Aware Fill dialog box through several different ways. The first being is to go up to Edit and then scroll down to Fill. Now you can also press Shift and F5 on your keyboard at the same time in order to bring it up. Now there are some shorter shortcuts in order to actually bring up the Content Aware Fill window as well, and the first being is just to hit Delete on your keyboard when you are specifically on the background layer, and that'll bring up your fill window. Now if you by any chance actually have multiple layers, such as I do now, if you hit delete on anything but the locked background layer, it'll actually delete the image information, as you can see there, and that's not what we want. So instead of hitting just delete on that particular layer that sits above the background layer, if I just jump back through my history state, what we can do instead is hold down Shift and Delete, and that'll also bring up the Fill dialog box. Now from here, the next thing we need to essentially do is set the contents of the fill window. Now we need to change this from whatever the default is set to, and in my case it's foreground color, and we need to set that to Content Aware. After you set the contents, you do have the option of actually changing the blending mode. In most cases, I tend to leave the blending mode set to its defaults, which is normal, and its opacity set to 100%, but you can play around with that if you wish. So from here, all we need to do then is essentially click OK. So as you can see, Content Aware Fill has done a reasonable job at actually recreating what this scene would have looked like without that debris stuck in the mud. Now, it hasn't done a perfect job, but it has actually given a really good starting point for continuing to actually just fine-tune what it's actually, the adjustments that it's actually made for this image. So essentially, Content Aware Fill is really good for removing unwanted objects. It's great for when you're actually stitching panoramas together and using Photoshop, of course, and you end up with an image that's missing areas, either top or bottom or sides of the panorama, where it can actually reproduce those areas in order for you to actually be able to crop a nice looking panorama. So if I just quickly deselect this, you'll notice here that we have sort of some outlines around the image, that around the selection I should say, that sort of need adjusting. And this is where the spot healing brush tool comes in very good, and also the cloning stamp. So essentially, if you go to the spot healing brush tool, or you can press J on your keyboard in order to bring that up, what you'll notice up the top here is you also have, as a sampling type, you have Content Aware. So this is the second place that you'll actually find Content Aware, and it'll do a similar job, but obviously for a smaller area, just by clicking, making sort of a rough brush size around the area you want to actually affect, and then making one simple click has actually gone ahead and removed that particular rock. Now, once again, that hasn't done a great job, so what I might do is just quickly undo that. We're just going to go to our brush size, and I might just increase the hardening. Now, once I've done that, we'll try again, and let's see if we get a better result. This time it's slightly better, not perfect. I might just reduce the size of my brush, and this time it's done a great job. So essentially what we need to do now with the area that we applied our content fill to is go around and just adjust those areas around the outside of our selection, and just remove areas that have been duplicated and just don't quite look right. Now, for this particular work, I tend to prefer to use the clone tool, as I think it gets me a better result, and I can actually specify exactly what I want to replace those areas with. As you can see, just making a few adjustments with the spot healing brush tool is not doing the best job that I'm after. So instead of doing that, if I just quickly go to my history, we'll just jump back a few states. And what I'll do instead is actually get my clone stamp, and we'll actually go and select some areas and work my way around. So with the clone stamp, you can be really quick with your adjustments if you know the areas that you actually want to replace the affected areas or the outside edges of that selection. So just by making a few slight adjustments there to what's been already adjusted by Content Aware Fill, we can end up with a result that's relatively pleasing to the eye. Now obviously you want to reduce the duplication of specific areas, like where I had here, just here. You would have noticed that just there. So you want to try and replace those areas with areas that don't quite look as duplicated, you know, right next to each other, because then they look a little bit strange. So one thing to keep in the back of your mind is that Content Aware is very process intensive, and it can use up quite a lot of RAM from your computer, especially depending on the file size and resolution of your image. Now, if you're having trouble with respects to RAM and are running a relatively slow computer with Photoshop, you can actually adjust the amount of RAM allocated in the performance settings of Photoshop to combat this issue, and we'll discuss this in a submodule called Custom Settings and Configuration. So now that you've seen the potential of Content Aware Fill and what it's capable of, make sure you put it to good use, because it is extremely helpful for retouching and restoring photos. But just keep in mind that you're most likely going to have to make some finer adjustments to the outside edges of your selections, and also those areas that get reproduced and duplicated that just don't quite look right.